Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to what I believe is going to be a fantastic conversation on a very relevant and timely topic. To many of us, supply chains were always something that happened in the background. There were this mysterious force that made sure that anything and everything was in the right place at the right time. And because of which, we took them for granted. And for many, many years, we overlooked investments in ships and ports and multimodal infrastructure. Well, today, we're all paying attention. And thankfully, we were able to gather some thought leaders on the topic. And with us today, we have Mr. Kurt Wendelken, the Vice Commander of the Naval Supply Systems Command. We also have Dr. Salvatore Marcagliano, who himself is a former merchant mariner and now chairs the History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science Department at Campbell University and is the host of the very popular social media channel, What's Going On with Shipping. And then we have Miss Abby Lilly, who serves as the Vice President of Global Supply Chain for Lockheed Martin's Rotary and Mission Systems business, and is also the chair of their corporate-wide supply chain council. And last, but certainly not least, we have Major General Maxwell, the ooh, the Joint Staff Vice Director for Logistics. And to start us off, Major General Maxwell, let's try to frame the problem. Please tell us, what are your major supply chain concerns?
Thanks, Tony, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I would just, in the joint staff on the J4, I'm the current ops guy. That's what I do. And so clearly current ops is kind of really focused on Ukraine right now and the conflict that is going on, and specifically focused on a couple of key areas. One, the distribution side of the house. Over the last month and a half, what you've seen is Transcom's ability to leverage really both the military capacity and capability that we have, as well as significant support from the commercial industry in being able to both deploy forces in a very dynamic, responsive time, but also to deliver material in support of Ukraine and the nation's efforts to sustain the Ukrainian forces. And so we are seeing that, and that is very clearly a focus and the key challenges that we are dealing with today. The third part of that now, as we have been spending that time delivering the forces, posturing them, as well as delivering material, is stepping back into the next part of the question, which is, where do we reconstitute? How quickly can we reconstitute supplies and materials, not only that have been drawn down out of Department of Defense resources, but also that have been drawn down from partners and allies who have contributed? And how quickly and effectively and efficiently can we get back and reconstitute those materials for those partners and allies and U.S. forces? And what we're seeing now is the challenges of the supply chain, which is either constraints in obsolete parts that may be in very limited supply, having to be re-engineered, or just the production lines and the limited capacity on production lines that are clearly not postured to be able to be on a rapid wartime kind of rapid building and manufacturing scale that we are finding ourselves in. Now, that isn't across the board, but it is clearly in a couple of very unique items that we have been asked to support and sustain, and probably 6 months ago we would not have anticipated. And so much like COVID, much like a few other things, there have been some supply chain problems that have emerged as a result of current ops and thus the nature and situation in the world.
Great, and thanks for that, General. I was assuming you were going to say we don't have any supply chain concerns, but certainly appreciate the insight. Mr. Wendelkin, are your concerns similar to that of the generals?
So I share all of those concerns and additional concerns. So we are also supporting current ops, and there are lots of challenges there. But we also have multiple other lines of effort where we're trying to work on improving Navy supply chain writ large. About 2 years ago, when both me and Admiral Stamatopoulos came into our positions, Admiral Lesher, the vice chief, called us in and told us that he really wanted a supply chain reset. So we're in the middle of a very significant supply chain transformation inside a Navy, in addition to the support to forces around the world. We're working on multiple lines of effort, and it's all underneath the banner of Navy's Get Real, Get Better, which I know has been talked about quite a bit here. We are to benchmark people who are world class in supply chain and then try to raise ourselves to that standard. Admiral Lesher also made Admiral Stamatopoulos the supported commander for supply chain inside of Navy, which was a little interesting because he's not always the most senior officer in the room. But in this space, Admiral Lesher was clear that those supply chains were key. And another challenge that we have, much the same that General Maxwell mentioned, is a lot of these systems that we operate that are built for us by key partners, they're very complex pieces of equipment. And although we did get an education in supply chain during COVID about its general fragility, the products that we're dealing with are very complicated. They're not Pert shampoo, they're not Snickers, they're not things from Amazon. Partners like Abby and others, it can take them a year to 2 years to go make those things for us, and that's assuming that they understand what our demand signal is. And when we surprise them, we all become surprised because we don't have the things that we need. So for our big end-to-end supply chain transformation, it's called NSS Supply, and it's a multi-year plan focused on 6 big pillars with end-to-end integration across Navy supply chain. And we are making good progress. And again, it's thanks to many of our mission partners. Another key thing that came out of COVID for us was the implementation of Microsoft Teams across Navy. We never had such a powerful collaboration tool. And 2 times a week, Admiral Stamatopoulos gets the entire enterprise together, and we are able to identify supply chain problems before they grow into large supply chain problems and apply the resources to get them better. On the 3rd day, on Friday, we do an abbreviated version of that, but we also are engaged in a campaign of learning where we bring in different supply chain topics for folks across our enterprise to increase their professional knowledge and for us to learn a little bit more about what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I appreciate that you mentioned surprises. There aren't many good supply chain surprises in my experience. So, Miss Lilly, what's it like from the perspective of a major defense contractor? What's your supply chain concerns?
Well, my mother always taught me that if I didn't have anything good to say about something, that I shouldn't say anything at all. But, I will say that, when you look across the defense industrial base, a vast majority of the defense industrial base is aligned with the mission of the warfighter and the missions that we have to carry on behalf of our country and on behalf of our allies across the world. But I will also say that they're facing some challenges, and those challenges include the ones you see in the paper every day, like labor availability. When you think about the great resignation that has happened in this country in the last several months, and the number of people who have left the workforce, that is impacting the defense industrial base. And when I talk to companies, I've heard, on the high side, 15 to 20% turnover in some of the companies that support Lockheed Martin. And those companies are struggling to hire new workers, to train them to do what we need to do. And as as you pointed out, sometimes the supply chains are very long to get to where we need to be. So labor availability is one of the key things that we're concerned about in the defense industrial base. And the second one that I have a significant concern about are those few companies who grew up as a part of the technology boom of the late 90s and into early 2000s, whose mission isn't necessarily 100% aligned with the Department of Defense priorities and with our capability, with our priorities. But those pieces of technology are instrumental into some of the systems and the capabilities that we're developing to create the connected battle space. And so making sure that we can align those companies' priorities with what we need to make sure that we continue to support the warfighter in a timely manner is something that keeps me up at night and has given me a few gray hairs this year.
I didn't notice. And thank you for that. In particular, your mentioning of the importance of labor. I can't begin to tell you how many meetings I've been in just over the years where since the commoditization of logistics, people often forget that at the end of the day, it's people that make this work. It's people that sail the ships. It's people that drive the trucks. It's people that operate the cranes. And that often goes forgotten when people think of logistics as simply a commodity that could be bought and sold. Now, from the academic community, Doctor, what supply chain concerns keep you up at night, other than looking over students' term papers on the topic?
Well, first, Tony, I appreciate it, and I want to thank the Navy League for the opportunity to come here. Obviously, the issues with the supply chain on the commercial side resonate directly with the warfighter. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, we can all remember the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, which hit us all where we live. And I think that issue right there demonstrated how tight our supply chain is. You know, 1956, you get a North Carolina truck driver who creates the concept of containerization. And now 70 years later, we're at the max of that system and we're experiencing that. Everything from the 100 ships that were anchored off of LA and Long Beach back in November to the current issue right now with ships anchored off Charleston and Houston and New York, New Jersey. I think the issue within the supply chain that we've been seeing is it's become so integrated from ship to road to rail that the most modern issue we've seen is akin to a world war disrupting shipping. That's the closest I can come to where we are right now. The impact of COVID and then a myriad of other issues have just created waves through the supply chain crisis that are being felt by everybody right now. Every time we try to get a handle, we think we're coming back down from it, the next black swan event hits us. And there is obviously a flock of these black swans because they just keep hitting one after the other. And in terms of the academic side, I think one of the things we need to understand is that our supply chain situation was already critical before COVID hit. 2015, the Federal Maritime Commission did an extensive report on our ports, for example. And one of the things they identified was critical shortfalls and issues within those ports. If you look at that report and you read it today, it's 90% hits exactly the issues that we're experiencing right now. And we're talking a lot about port infrastructure. We're talking a lot about building our base, but there are still key issues that are missing right now. And I think it's really important to understand when we can't move cargo out of the ports, when all of a sudden Union Pacific has to stop hauling rail cars out of LA and Long Beach for 2 weeks, what's the implications if we have to go out of the country for a military operation, for a contingency operation? Can we surge out if we're having the difficulty of surging in? And this has been impacting across the board. The regular transportation of goods has been really pushed to the limit. We're seeing it right now with Strategic Sea Lift, where we have about 15% of the Strategic Sea Lift fleet out right now performing missions that normally we would look toward the commercial merchant marine to do, but we can't because of ship charters. They're just not available. So, you have the Gopher State, you have the Cape Race, you have the Cape Washington over in Europe right now, performing missions that typically would be done by commercial ships. And I think this interaction between the commercial and the military side is really important because as we heard mentioned here, the availability to get personnel, to get truck drivers in, that, there's chassis, a very simple component that back in the Cold War, we had yards full of truck chassis that don't exist anymore. And now all of a sudden we have containers that are taking up chassis. We can't move goods. What happens if we have that contingency where we need to move? So I think what's happening in the supply chain on the civilian side is really impacting our military ability to perform our missions, to get the supplies we need to contractors. Toilet paper is obviously a funny issue to talk about, but when it's key elements of microprocessors, when it's raw materials that we can't get, that's going to impact us for ship deliveries, for car manufacturers. We see it right now.
Yeah, and thanks for that. Now, what worries me is what happens if somebody disrupts us on purpose. And your analogy of this being a World War type disruption, I think, is really a keen point. Now, back to you, General. It seems that manufacturing capacity and the defense industrial base, well, that's only half of the equation. And with the joint warfighter operating all over the globe, what distribution requirements will we need to support those military operations?
Yeah, so I think what you're what you're seeing today, and when we will talk about contested logistics in, and oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind is this environment where you have an adversary actively contesting something in a forward position or a forward area. But the reality is we are living a contested logistics environment today, here and now, in what we're doing. And all the panelists just talked about the examples of that, particularly in the supply chain. So for a department that relies substantially on the commercial carriers to either deliver the material by surface and or to deliver our forces and our troops traditionally by air through commercial airlift and the agreements that we have in place. As these domestic supply chain constraints start competing, we find ourselves challenged in just being able to look at now what real capacity can we bring to bear in a contested environment where you have an adversary that is also trying to disrupt what you're doing. And so then you start stepping into things that Abby was talking about our networks and our data environment. But more so also, it's requiring us to start thinking about the ability to be able to distribute and deliver in faster and smaller force packages than what we've traditionally thought about and traditionally done. And the ability to do that is absolutely imperative, both from just a speed and responsiveness, being able to meet the anticipated mission requirements in a distributed operating environment that we are increasingly faced with needing to do just to be able to conduct the operations and survive in those operations that we need to be able to do to fight and win. And so the types of capabilities start getting us to asking the question, as commercial manufacturing continues to build bigger and larger ships that optimize the supply chain, that may not be the solution, and those aren't necessarily the solutions for the deployment and the delivery of forces, not only strategically from CONUS to points of employment, but also within theaters when you think about the Pacific theater particularly, where heavily maritime domain, we talk about last tactical mile, but when you step into that environment, you have to talk about capabilities that can deliver smaller force packages quickly in the last tactical 1,000 miles.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it seems like flexibility and nimbleness is going to be key to success there. Speaking of which, Mr. Wendelken, how is the Navy adjusting its supply chains to contend with this increasingly dynamic global environment?
Yeah, I think the most powerful way is through how we're engaging with key suppliers. So part of Get Real, Get Better is embracing the red. And I'll poke at us first. I think in the past we were very transactional. We didn't really engage with industry. We had a requirement for something. We had our great women and men who do our contracting, and we told them, hey, go fill this requirement, and they engaged with industry, and they got our requirement filled. What we have learned by benchmarking world-class organizations is that we learned we really weren't very good customers. And part of our journey has been to become better customers and to have candid and open conversations with our key suppliers. It's one of the things that we engage in while we're here at Sea Air Space. We have scheduled meetings with our top suppliers, and it's really an opportunity for us to really talk to each other, to try to understand our perspectives and how we can work together for better outcomes. I'd share with you, NavSup has about 900 suppliers. About 80% of those are single-threaded suppliers. Those are the supplier for that thing. I don't have another source, so I have to think more about, am I level loading my providers with my demand? Do they understand my demand pattern? Am I making my demand pattern more predictable so they can keep their workforce gainfully employed, so they don't go off and look for another job, or that plant goes and starts working on something different? So I think really for us that was a key thing. We also put an executive, Ms. Karen Fenstermacher, in a new position called Strategic Supplier Management in 2019. So she leads this organization and engages routinely with, again, our key suppliers. We're focused really on our top 50. We do about $2 billion a year in business with them. And that has really proven to us that it's key. We're also working with ASN RDNA with Vice Admiral Morley. He joins Admiral Stamatopoulos in these engagements with industry, because we really want to speak to industry with a single Navy voice. So if Navy is procuring a new weapon system, we really want to talk about how we're going to sustain those weapon systems up front and make decisions for Navy that are better. And again, maybe for our industry partners, do the whole order all at once with the new piece of gear and the support that goes with it. And again, I think in the past, we often would buy a new piece of gear, sustainment would be handed off to a different organization with less focus, and maybe our supplier had decided to do something different with that production line. So I think that those are the things that we're really doing to address the realities of the defense industrial base, and really to try to get real and get better.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I realize how difficult that is. I'm a former contracting officer, let's say recovering contracting officer myself. And it is very difficult because as you're taught the clinical nature of federal contracting, the FAR is your scripture, or the DFAR in the case of military. Well, there's no room for friendships there. And it is a geologic shift to be able to look at contractors as strategic partners, recognizing that the government can't do its job without those contractors. So let's peer into the future a little bit. And Ms. Lilly, what lasting impact do you believe the pandemic has had on the defense industrial base? Basically, what I'm asking you, are my kids going to be up on stage having this discussion 30 years from now?
I think they absolutely will. But when I think about what we've learned through the pandemic, I go back to the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. I'll never forget. When a crisis comes, you don't forget some of those early parts of that crisis. And Frank St. John, who was at the time the head of Rotary and Mission Systems and now our COO, he came to me and he said, "What are you going to need to keep the defense industrial base stable?" Well, that's a very simple question. So I polled the team and I said, what do we think we're going to need to make sure that the defense industrial base can weather the pandemic crisis that seems to be increasing, but also the double crisis that we were facing at the time with a lot of the defense industrial base who was also involved in in commercial airliner crisis that was happening in the country at the same time. So When the team pulled together, and they did a great job, pulled together a list of about 30 things that they thought we were going to need to weather the pandemic. But it really boiled down to two things. And one was we were facing multiple closures across the industrial base. We had states, counties, municipalities, all with different regulations around what was essential, what workers could go into the workplace. So we needed a declaration from the Department of Defense that the defense industrial base was essential. And the second piece of that, with the two crises happening within the industrial base at the same time, we needed ready access to cash to make sure that the defense industrial base stayed stable financially through the pandemic. And I will say, much to my amazement, in partnership with the Department of Defense, we got both of those within 2 weeks. And so that gave us the ability to then make sure that the defense industrial base stayed operating, stayed financially healthy through the pandemic. At Lockheed Martin, we've accelerated payments every week since the 1st of April 2020 into the defense industrial base, on average about $430 million a week, to make sure that the defense industrial base stays stable, with the priority being on the 8,600 small businesses that we contract with on an annual basis. And so, we've tried to make sure that we target that cash to the right places. Now, I will also say, one of the lessons that we've learned is that there is still great resiliency in the defense industrial base. A lot of people will talk about the fragility that exists in the defense industrial base because of the single sources of supply. But I will also tell you, the last trip that I took before March of 2020 was to go see a very small business in California. It was a former UC professor who created a new piece of technology we were deploying into one of our systems. And we'd gotten through all of the engineering development tests, and now it was time to transition that product into production. I will say they were struggling a bit at the time, and that's the reason I visited, because we had a very steep ramp in production that we needed to support the mission that we were serving. And I came back from that visit, believing that I was probably going to be visiting frequently that supplier. But we were able to deploy, somebody to partner with them on production capability. We ended up doing that virtually. And I gave them a few pieces of advice, as some would say. I don't know if they took it as advice at the time. But I will say that company and the owner listened and took the advice head on and achieved more than I thought they could achieve, especially given the situation we were faced with the pandemic. And so when you think about the capability that exists in the US today, it is still incredible what we can do in a very, very short amount of time with the right priority and the right resources to make sure that we get it done. Now, on the flip side of that coin, I think one of the other lessons that we've learned from the pandemic is that there are some pretty significant fragilities out there, both in terms of single sources of supply, and as I mentioned earlier, sources of supply whose business model isn't necessarily aligned with the Department of Defense. And so, as we come out of the pandemic, we're really taking a look at how can we make sure that we either, primarily work with companies whose mission is aligned with ours and with our customers' missions, or how do we make sure that we minimize the impact that those companies have on our ability to support the warfighter? And minimizing the impact that those companies have on our support could mean, pieces of inventory that we would hold in strategic supply. It could mean developing second sources of supply, or creating our own indigenous capability to be able to support those pieces of technology that we're incorporating into our product.
Yeah, thanks for that. Anybody up for a road trip? So 50 miles, I'm up for it too. 50 miles northeast of us, we've got a stark reminder of these supply chain challenges with the grounded vessel, the Ever Forward. His name is a bit of a misnomer. Um, Doc, how is our infrastructure keeping up with this evolving technology like these larger container ships?
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen is a change in how we move goods on the world's oceans. Ships have gotten larger, faster, bigger. We're consolidating those ships into fewer companies. 9 companies and 3 large alliances control 85% of the world's ocean container transportation. But just to give you an example on the port infrastructure, Everforward is a classic example of the fragility of some of our infrastructure. Had that ship not been going as fast as it was, had it blocked the channel to Baltimore, we would think, well, Baltimore, a small port, doesn't have really major impact. Yet, major container terminal, major coal distribution, major car and roll-on, roll-off facility, and 6 strategic sea lift vessels, all based up there, 2 fast sea lifts, 2 LMSRs, 2 roll-on, roll-off ships. And you can conceivably see the blockage of a port. You know, go back to 1950, the Missouri runs aground leaving out of Norfolk. Took 2 weeks, 19 salvage vessels to free that vessel. We're now going to be into a month until you see Everforward removed. And it's kind of indicative in how we're investing in our ports. We've seen the dredging of our harbors. We've seen the investment in ship-to-shore cranes, largely built in China. We've seen the development of larger and larger ports, LA and Long Beach handling 40% of our containers. But what's been missing is some key elements of infrastructure to sustain those ports. Larger tugs, more dredges, salvage vessels. You know, for the want of a $50 million fireboat in San Diego Harbor, you could have conceivably maybe have halted the fire on Bonhomme Richard. And I think that's some of the infrastructure that we see that doesn't get, you know, no one wants to be on board a commissioning of a dredge. They don't. It's just, it's just not a great moment to be on. Yet when you have a need to keep those ports open to ensure the safety, you know, I can remember back when we used to have to load the fast sea lift ships at Savannah, and we were always sitting on the bottom in Savannah because that port was so shallow when we loaded the fast sea lift ships to go to Iraq, to Kuwait back in 2003, and even before that in 1990. You know, today we've been investing heavily in our ports, but there's still vital elements that we need to look at. And again, it's very complementary to the military. You know, our investment in ports right now, we got to remember, the federal government controls the waters, yet it's states and municipalities that run our ports. And I would say the Maritime Administration, through the Port Infrastructure Grant Program, has a huge element in doing this. What's our national port structure? Because if we keep going the way we're going now, we're going to be having a few major large ports and let our smaller ports go by the wayside, when in truth, what we want to have is a diverse port infrastructure. We really need that. We need to see that we can use multiple ports to come out. As we shut down our military ocean terminals, we're more reliant on those ports right now. I'll give you a perfect example. A Marine soldier airman stationed out in Japan or Okinawa want to come back home. They want to ship their personal goods back home. You know, if you were shipping a shipping container from East Asia during November, it was 100 days. It was 100 days before you can get those containers home. But, you know, that is an issue of our logistics. It's one of the advantages, for example, of a U.S. merchant marine, because those ships get to go right to the front of the line. They jump ahead and they can offload in LA and Long Beach and come right in. So I think the Everforward is a good reminder of our need in our infrastructure. You know, the fact that we can't remove that ship, and really the fragility. We saw that with Ever Given. When Ever Given went sideways in the Suez and shut world trade off for 6 days, you know, it made everyone realize, okay, this is a disruption in our supply chain. And this has worldwide implications. You cannot have an event happen with, I don't even like the term supply chain, I like supply web, because it's not always, we tend to think it's linear, and it's not linear because it can be an event 5 places back that are now affecting an event down that chain, and now all of a sudden you're missing that one component that Ms. Lilly, I'm sure, could talk about in extreme details here. But that's the element we see, and we have to start looking at it holistically. And I think, you know, not just on the military side, but on the commercial side, because they're so integrated, they're so intertwined in many ways.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I love that term, supply web. I think that's absolutely accurate. And I love the fact that you pointed to that we need some intrinsic American control over that supply web. Right? And with all of this in mind, all of the challenges that we've talked about, General, what's your number one logistics priority for the Department of Defense?
Yeah, so I would actually, I'll pivot off what Sal just said, which is he talks about this supply web, which I think is very much the reality of kind of the environment. That supply web is only effective if you're actually able to see what's on it, where it's at, and how you what options you have to move and maneuver to get it. And so as we look towards these future capabilities, the nirvana of logistics, rocket-based cargo, or autonomous delivery, or the ability to manufacture things all the way forward at the point of need, uh, the reality is we're going to continue to deal today with scarcity of resources, whether it is materials, whether it is transportation, movement, and distribution capabilities. And the only way you can manage that, and within the department that we can effectively manage it, is through what we characterize as resilient integrated logistics command and control. And when we talk about resiliency in this framework, it is very much this understanding that there is a web of available resources and the ability to see them, and such that if something gets taken out at a node, if I can understand uh, where I can alternative nodes I can reach to, alternative methods of delivery for modes, then we create resiliency. It's also resiliency is achieved through data hardening and hardening the cyber network, and particularly in the logistics environment, that cyber network, that logistics network goes not within just the Department of Defense information network, but reaches into and touches in a vast number of systems into the commercial sector. And so it is not just hardening the DODIN, but it's also understanding the security and hardening of our commercial industry partners, so that we have shared security and resiliency in that context. Um, and then as we think about from an integrated perspective, it's also a recognition that the integration may not necessarily be exclusive to the United States. The integration may also need to be looking at opportunities and where we can leverage our partners and in our allies and locally available resources in a time of need that might be available. And I would also say recognizing we tend to discount the global might of many of our U.S.-based industries who have global presence in many cases that oftentimes we don't think about, but that become part of this resilient integrated logistics system. The ability to see ourselves, understand what the environment is, make a decision on it, and then act is all predicated on being able to understand this web type of environment and the ability to make those decisions in time of need and at speed.
Yeah. I'm sensing a theme of partnerships. Mr. Wendelken, let's go back to you. How can the Navy and industry work together to improve supply chain performance?
Yeah. So I'm going to yes and everything that I've heard on the panel so far.
It's a very easy answer.
It is, and it's not the complete answer, but agree that it's a web, and agree it's all about partnerships. And so the point about limiting surprises to the extent we can, I think that's key. What I spoke about earlier about having really open and honest communications with each other is also key. So we are all in with the industry partners, and the reason we're all in is because we've been told that the Navy's got to be ready to respond to potential challenges in very short order. We don't have the luxury of 20 years to get this all squared away, and and corrected. So I think our continued engagement with industry is critical. We are learning from industry because we are not world class in a lot of the things that we do, and it's really important that we become world class. We think there is a definite readiness boost for the Navy in the improvement of its supply chains and the partnership with industry, and potentially there's also some opportunity to find some resources that could be applied somewhere else.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. Can I get a voice check in the back? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm told that my microphone was cutting in and out. Um, Doctor, you know I had to ask you this question, right? What impact does the decline in our merchant marine have on our nation's global supply chains?
Well, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious, talked about it a second ago, that so much of our supply chain is based outside the United States. I mean, if you look at top 15 companies, whether it's shipping, whether it's leasing containers, whether it's chassis, I mean, it's not American. And again, you know, I'm not one who believes we need to be 100% American. That's a fallacy that some people will talk about. However, you do need some contingency in there. I'll give you the example and build off what General Maxwell said. Commercial has to be open in their networks lots of times. So they're very susceptible to cyber for attack. So Maersk in 2017 was hit by the NotPetya virus, took Maersk lines out for 3 weeks, cost them $300 million. Such an attack today would be catastrophic because in 2017, if I was shipping a container and Maersk Lines was down for 3 weeks, I could put it on another ship. You can't do that now. Now the capacity is at extreme. And one of the things that we're seeing is commercial companies self-sanctioning the operations in Russia and Ukraine, for example. We know about McDonald's and Starbucks, but we're seeing shipping companies. We're seeing a lot of companies self-sanctioning. You know, in our history, we've had wars that weren't always popular with people. What happens if a vital company self-sanctions us all of a sudden? Because we're not, we like to think we're the biggest business in town some days, but in truth, there's other trading partners out there that are growing and you know, again, the world's getting flat. And so we really have to be careful about that. You know, one of the things I write about in my history a lot is we passed a law back in 1920. It's referred to as the Jones Act. And what a lot of people will talk about is that refers just to cabotage. It just refers to the coastal trade. But what we found out in 1914 when World War I hit is our trade was basically almost entirely dependent for international trade on foreign shipping. And what happened is that shipping left. The British, the French, the Italians, the Germans headed for port. And what happened was US goods piled up on our dock. Charter rates went 20 times what charter rates had been. The cost to ship cotton increased 16 times what it is. And in 1920, we created a national maritime strategy, what was the Jones Act. It wasn't just cabotage. It was international shipping. It was shipbuilding. It was the role of the merchant marine as an auxiliary to the military in time of peace. It was seamen's rights. And one of the things that concerns me today is that we don't have that coastal trade anymore. We don't have that Jones Act fleet we can build on. But, you know, and it's through a series of events. You know, we built the interstate highway system, the interstate pipeline system, so we don't need ships like that anymore. We had issues, government. We ended the Merchant Marine Act of '36, the construction differential subsidies. So shipbuilding went overseas. And one of the things that makes me really concerned is international shipbuilding or international shipping companies, we would like to think would be on our side, but we're not 100% sure about that. And a lot of key commodities, there was just a report by Commissioner Benzel from the Federal Maritime Commission about how China has really manipulated and controlled the container and chassis trade. And, you know, we're seeing now in the House and Senate Ocean Shipping Reform Acts coming in. There's talk about making it so that we can, again, get some oversight. We basically deregulated. And don't get me wrong, we benefited greatly by deregulation. We get the lowest transportation costs ever before. But one of the things we did is we exposed ourselves, I would argue, in a national security issue. And so, you know, when we talk about building a domestic U.S. merchant marine, again, I go back to that, you know, airmen, marine, and sailor sitting out there in Okinawa or Japan, just coming back home, and now they got to wait to get their own goods. It's going to take 100 days if they're sailing on a foreign ship, but if you load them on a Matson ship or an APL ship, they're back in a lot faster. That's, you know, small scale, but again, that's the morale of our warfighters. We want them to have that. And one of the things we saw recently is APL, which is one of these companies that ship on the West Coast. They operate 6 container ships. One of them had an issue, had a fire, went out of service, and we saw what happened when you went from a 6-ship service down to a 5-ship service. It was literally crippling in some cases. That would be magnified in case of a contingency and a war. And we've seen it right now with the closure of Red Hill. You know, we did what the Japanese couldn't do in 1941. We took out the fuel at Hawaii. You know, but do we have the tankers to fill that requirement to be able to get us across the Pacific in a potential peer-to-peer conflict when we lose Hawaii as that central staging base? In World War II, we had the Warshipping Administration. We were building tankers. We can do that. There was a marriage, almost a symmetry, a kind of a bonding between the commercial and the military. But today, unfortunately, the commercial just isn't there in sufficient numbers for us to support the military. And that's the concern I have.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Miss Lilly, I'm going to ask you once again to be our fortune teller. What challenges do you see with our future supply chains?
So, you know, sometimes I like to joke that the 3 key tools that I have to manage the supply chain are my magic 8-ball, my crystal ball, and my abby-cadabby wand. So I'll look in the crystal ball. But you know, when I think about where we're headed from a defense industrial base supply chain standpoint, you know, one of the things that, you know, we're working on in partnership with many of our customers is the digitization of that supply chain. And so as we think about creating new products and services in an all digital environment, you know, we're extending that digital environment throughout the supply chain. And as General Maxwell pointed out earlier, one of the keys to enable that is to make sure that from a cybersecurity standpoint, we've got the right systems in place to be able to support that digitization of the supply chain. And so one of the things that we're currently working on to make sure that, especially the small suppliers who bring those key pieces of technology into the defense industrial base, is making sure that they're educated on the cybersecurity requirements for the future, including CMMC, to make sure that they can work with us in that all digital environment that we'll be working in, you know, now and into the future. You know, the other thing that, you know, I really do believe that as we move forward more in partnership, and I have to compliment the Department of the Navy, because they've been most proactive in terms of bringing the supply chain leaders of the large primes together. You know, I participate in a very regular meeting with the other large primes to talk about the issues that we're seeing, and we talk about how, you know, we can potentially solve some of those better together. But you know, when I think about, you know, the pieces of technology that have to come into the supply chain to support a connected battle space, we have to think about the regulations. And we talked earlier about the FARs, and the DFARs are the Bible by which we live each and every day. But I can tell you, some of the new entrants into the defense industrial base who have the technology that we want look at some of the FARs and DFARs and the pages of regulations that we flow down to them and say, I'm not sure this is worth it. And so we need to make sure that we're looking at the acquisition regulations as well in the future as we bring that technology into the defense industrial base, into the products and services that our warfighter need, to make sure that we can bring that technology to the right place at the right time, and that we will have a supply base that's willing to support us.
Yeah, I really appreciate that commentary, particularly about the FAR and DFAR. And in some sense, you know, the government could be calcified in how it looks at acquisitions, and we do have to be more nimble if we're going to be able to expand the defense industrial base, particularly if we have to do so quickly. Now, with that concludes my questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. Otherwise, we could certainly read passages from the Federal Acquisition Regulations if you prefer that.
Yeah, I
Good
would like.
morning, leaders. Matt Evers, Association of Marine Corps Logisticians. We're committed to professional development of Marines through exchanges like this, MarineCorpsLogistics.org. And Dr. Mercogliano, I really appreciate your What's Going On with Shipping YouTube channel. It's really helped with my master's education in transportation. On education, my question for the panel is, you alluded to this throughout the discussion this morning, but what are the training and education, the new skills that we need, whether you're a warfighting sustainer in any of the services, or you're an industry professional supporting national security? What are the new training and education imperatives that we need to look to?
So I'll come up front and say within the Department of Defense, I think it is, as particularly in the logistics and supply chain community, it is becoming comfortable and adept at operating in a digital environment, and that is tough for folks that have grown up in a completely different frame and way of looking at it, and so for the young officers, the staff NCOs, new new recruits are largely way more comfortable than we are, and our challenge is how do you leverage that and bring that on, and expose it and grow some folks like me to be more comfortable in that environment. That's our challenge going forward because we've got to be able to operate there. That's the only way we can work, operate, and function with speed.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, General Maxwell. As we think about the workforce of tomorrow, they're already in that digital environment. And so one of the things that we've done at Lockheed Martin is really to focus on reverse mentorship. And so, I've got a mentor who is, a very young millennial. And she teaches me a lot about, how to communicate with the workforce more effectively and make sure that I'm hitting home with, the thousand professionals that support my part of the organization. Because 40% of the workforce that I have are millennials, and so she's really helped me, in terms of understanding better communication channels and ways to say things that hit home with a different generation than mine. And so I really value the reverse mentorship piece from an education standpoint.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same for us, right? As we hunt for leverage and ways to improve our supply chains, it's all in data and it's all in digital. So it's exactly the same for us. And we have the exact same challenges that the world is changing, and we have to work with our teams to help them adapt and become more comfortable with how work is done today.
I would just add on the academic side, I get more students today asking about how do I get into careers in supply chain and looking at that. And I think if Department of Defense would focus on that a lot, I know the warfighter ethos is great, but I think right now there is a cognizant recognition of the importance of logistics, supply chain, supply and web, whatever we want to call it right now. And really peeling that onion back and exposing it and showing how vital it is really important. And I appreciate the comment too, by the way. Thanks.
Can we take another question?
Yep, John Conrad with G Captain. The container is the innovation that has pulled more people out of poverty and done more to improve conditions around the world than any other container. That's Mark Levinson said. But it was a failure for 10 years until the Army and the Marine Corps came in Vietnam and put the money and the skill into building Cam Ranh Bay, as detailed in Sal Mercogliano's book. I've become a very popular man writing about the logistics supply chain because I looked at the problem and I found out the solutions are in the military, specifically with the Marine Corps. The biggest problem with the Port of LA right now is these mega ships are being built and they're going from Shanghai to LA, and they're fighting a war of attrition, where I was introduced to maneuver warfare tactics in John Boyd. So when I see a problem, with the Ever Given and the Forward and the LA, I'm just calling some of my Marine Corps friends and saying, what are the ways to maneuver around this? Conversely, when something like Red Hill happens, my tanker guys on the commercial side are like, do they understand how a tanker works? Does the Navy? We want to help, and there's no impetus to do so. So I was just at the biggest shipping conference in North America last week, and there was not a single person in Navy uniform or Marine Corps uniform at that conference. So if the DoD and the Navy and Marine aren't getting out on the ships in the ports, how are they going to help fix these problems, and how can they learn the lessons from the commercial side? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think if I take your question, first of all, how can the Navy Marine Corps be more involved in understanding the challenges of the commercial shipping industry uh, in order to inform operating concepts? I think there's definitely some there. There's some there. We will, as a DoD, I think we find ourselves always kind of tending to focus on what can I buy, what can I procure, what can I manufacture under a DoD contract that is for DoD use. But I'll go back to where I started, which is when you look at the amount of material that is moved in behalf of the Department of Defense, the vast majority of it moves on the commercial network. And so I think we've got to change our way of thinking that gets us more into this business perspective. And to your point, I think Sal kind of touched on what some of the options might be from a maneuverist perspective when we look at how many ports we've limited ourselves to because of the size of the ships and that sort of thing that open up a different framework of kind of what maneuver on the ocean on the oceans and or in the air might look like.
I would just add, McLean was able to sell containerization. He'd been 10 years trying to sell this concept, couldn't sell it. And then in November of '65, Vietnam, you had 122 ships piled up off of Vietnam, very akin to what you saw at LA and Long Beach. McLean and his staff flew, they met with the Army Material Command and sold them on the idea of containers. And with 11 ships, they cleared the backlog. And I think one of the things when you talked about reforming the DFAR, for example, I think, again, the military has always been on the forefront of innovation, whether it's marine technology, whether it's shipping. And again, I think we got to loosen that up because I do think that military has to find logistical, they have to make it work, and they will make it work. And that's why I think that what happens in the military is so important to get that information out because they will. Another incarnation, I was with the MPS program, used to go down to Blunt Island all the time. And those are Marines that can get a ship offloaded, whether it's at Blunt Island or off the coast of Somalia, we'll get them offloaded. And there are ways to overcome that. But unfortunately, the information tends to stay very localized now. We need to do a better job getting that info out.
Yeah, and I'll chime in here a little bit, John. I think you'd be surprised at the strength of the bond between the commercial shipping industry, the Maritime Administration, and the Department of Defense. So while we work for different departments, there is no stovepiping between us. We're effectively one partner when it comes to commercial sea lift. That's effectively my job, and that's something that I'm accountable for, is to ensure that the military has access to that commercial sea lift when they need it. And we certainly value our partnerships with the U.S. Transportation Command, with the J4, with the Navy, and with others to make that a success. When we need the ships are there to meet the military's needs. When we need the ships for commercial purposes, the ships are there to meet the economy's needs. And that's part of my role at MARAD. We have 1 minute left. We could take a very, very quick question.
Hello, my name is Frank Kennedy. I work for GEA Westphalia. OEM supplies high-speed centrifugal purifiers to the Navy Military Sea Lift Command and the Coast Guard. I'm going to make it very quick because it's a very long, detailed story. But the bottom line is there any DFARS or FAR regulations that state that any equipment supplied commercially to, say, Military Sea Lift Command should not be supplied from China?
I'm not an acquisition guy.
Yeah, and I hung up my warrant 6 years ago, so I think that's something, maybe we could talk afterwards and we could get you in touch with a contracting officer for, are you talking for defense business or civilian business?
It's defense business, but it's not non-combatant.
All right.
And so if I could talk to you after the meeting and maybe if you can steer me in the right direction, I'd appreciate it.
Right. We'll find the right acquisition professional for you to talk to.
Thank you.
All right. And with that, the clock is now down to 0. I want to thank all the panelists. You all have been fantastic panel. And I think this has been an absolutely insightful discussion for me. And I want to thank all of you in the audience. I think you all have been a great audience. And if you'd like, come up to me afterwards and we could continue this conversation. Thank you all again.